What's up, Flannelverse? What's up, Endgamers? We are back. It is Monday Night Football. Cleveland at Denver should be a potentially, I don't know. I don't even know what to say anymore. Like, none of these games seem that fun. This one does not seem that fun to me, but it could be an interesting one. A lot of parts to talk about here. I am, of course, here as usual with Adam, ShipMyMoney, Scherer. We're going to be going position by position: quarterbacks, running backs, receivers, tight ends, defenses, kickers. We're not going to be doing the questions and lineup segment at the end, but you can ask questions throughout the show, and we are happy to answer them. While you're coming in, we are both new this year. Our YouTube channels, we're trying to grow them. Brand new YouTube channels this year. If you would subscribe to both the Flannelverse and Endgame Syndicate, Adam and I would both appreciate it. Adam, how are you doing today?
Doing pretty well. Can't be doing worse than yesterday. Felt really good going into yesterday. Like it's kind of rare for me with NFL to like not screw anything up from just a contest entry standpoint going in. And I actually did everything I wanted to do yesterday. Everything looked good. I felt good going in, and then had maybe my worst week of the season. It had to be close. If it wasn't, just got absolutely killed. So today has to be better.
Yeah, honestly, same. I felt so good about that slate in general. I was like, I feel like there are parts that the field is getting wrong, and things that I really want to lean into, like low owned plays that I was enthusiastic about. AJ Brown, for example, just things that were I feel like the field is missing something here. And
also really popular, by the way. Industry just completely missed on ownership on him.
AJ Brown, he only ended up at 6%.
He was 20 in the 555 milli.
Oh, okay. So I played the large field stuff. It was spot on in the large field stuff.
Oh, okay.
But ultimately, not a great day for me. I had a sweat for a while in the afternoon slate. Just needed Derrick Henry to score a touchdown instead. It was a sweat in the third quarter, and then by the fourth quarter, it was Saquon scoring a touchdown, Bucky Irving going off, all of the chalky pieces crushed in the end. So didn't have any real sweat there. We were talking in our Discord, Adam, not you and I, but a Discord that you and I are both in. Somebody said yesterday, it's negative EV to do content, and I feel like it was more true than ever yesterday because I just don't give myself enough time. One thing that I kept on rerunning the optimizer, trying to get to more of Terry McLaurin, or to get to some of Terry McLaurin. It's I'd like to have a couple of shares of Jaden Daniels with Terry McLaurin. So I kept on boosting his projection, just 0.2 fantasy points at a time. But usually when I'm not doing it, or it's been a while now since I've really done much NFL prep without doing content, but had enough time. I used to run 30 crunches, 40 crunches sometimes to get to the exposures I want. Now it's I have time to do 3. So just that, that's our 4 or 5, whatever. But so got to 0 Terry McLaurin. That would have been nice having the Jaden Daniels, Terry McLaurin stack. Yeah.
That was one that I looked at going in because I had a good amount of Jaden Daniels, and in small field stuff, I had a good amount of Jaden Daniels too. And I'm looking and I'm okay, pretty much all of my Jaden McDaniels is with at least one of Noah Brown or Zach Ertz, and not McLaurin. So I think it's fine. I understood how those lineups worked, where those guys were cheap. Daniels gives you upside, all of that. I thought the lineups were good, but I looked going in and I was man, I'm in trouble if it's the Daniels to McLaurin day. And then it just immediately is Daniels to McLaurin.
Yeah, day, 2 touchdowns. I don't know if I said Jaden McDaniels first, or if that's just you being an NBA brained, but you just said Jaden McDaniels, and unclear. I do that all the time though. Jaden McDaniels. I'm also a Timberwolves fan, so it just comes naturally saying Jaden McDaniels whenever I want to say Jaden Daniels.
And then I didn't even catch it until you said it.
And then the Showdown slate last night, I talked about really liking Jordan Mason. I mean, I wasn't super into it, but it was I think he's a good contingent upside type play. I talked about wanting to get above the field, and then I think I ended up with 1 share of Jordan Mason in more than 150 lineups across contests because I only had time to do 1 crunch after seeing things. So I gave him a boost, but not enough to get to him. I actually had some in my first run, and I was I want a little bit more than this, so I gave him a boost and then ended up with 0. So doing content is definitely negative EV for the DFS play, but we love to do it, or I love to do it. I think you hate to do it, but you feel obligated apparently.
So I didn't play Showdown last night, which was probably the only good decision I made yesterday. I was too busy late swapping NBA stuff and not doing that well either. But no, I mean, I enjoy content, kind of. Whenever I take a long content break and then I get back to it, I enjoy it and realize that I missed it. But the way I view it, it's absolutely negative EV for DFS play, and it's not. It's for the reasons you said. It's not, especially if you're playing larger field contests. It's not that you or me are making so many people so much better that we don't still have an advantage in what we're playing. That
Right.
would be more the case if like I was doing shows talking about how I'm playing 3-mans, like that would
Yeah.
be a problem.
Right.
But I'm not doing that. It's just the time element. Like you end up being rushed. It's why I pretty quickly stopped doing my morning NFL Sunday shows this week or this year. You know, it was like I was doing the show at like 10 or 10:30 or something. And in my head, I'm leaving myself plenty of time. But then every single week, I'm just like scrambling to get all my lineups in. And it's like, okay, this is not like I'm losing too much. I'm risking too much money. I'm losing too much money to do this. Yeah, that's where doing content is rough. But like the positive of it is getting consistent income, some sort of consistent money,
Yeah.
whatever. You know, it's a trade-off.
Yeah, it's a positive life EV, I would say, for me. Like, I'm glad I do content. I love doing content. I make money off of doing something that I love doing instead of having to be a lawyer, or something else. So I think like life wise, it's positive EV. But in terms of DFS play, it's just like I'm not going to make as good of lineups as I made when I would spend hours tinkering with my lineups until I got them to look exactly like I wanted to. Yeah, it's an interesting trade off, but I'm willing to make it, of course. All right. We should get into it because most of our audience does not do content. They don't care. They just want to talk about quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, et cetera, et cetera.
It's a Browns-Broncos game. I don't really know that they want to talk about it.
That's a good point. Yeah, no, nobody's that enthusiastic about talking about this one. This is like just I generally hate Chiefs showdown slates because like it's like, oh, who knows? Patrick Mahomes just randomly throw it to this third string tight end, whatever. This is like kind of the same thing. Like, it's just like you look at these teams, look at the usage in recent weeks, particularly the Broncos. It's like, I don't know, throw your hands up in the air, but we'll talk about that when we get to wide receivers, etc. Start with quarterbacks. We've got Bo Nix and Jameis Winston. I actually have not looked at Bo Nix's rushing numbers so far this year. So that might be something that need to look at to talk about how to correlate Bo Nix, like whether we're stacking him, because I know he runs a good amount. I'm not sure to what extent I need to be stacking him, but we'll get there. We're going to start looking at ownership. Bo Nix, 10,000, getting at captain. Man, 36%. I'm curious if this is going to hold. 36% projected ownership at captain for Bo Nix as of right now. In the flex, getting 51%. Is that what you're seeing, Adam? Your stuff?
It's pretty close. I think your numbers are a little higher. I have him lower at captain at 26%. I have him, I think, higher at flex at 62%. So a lot either way. And he does show up as the most frequent captain in optimal lineups. He does show up as the most frequent player in the flex spot in optimal lineups. That being said, this is one of the first shows we've done this year where I think a quarterback is going over-owned at both captain and flex. It's not that, again, it's not that he's a bad play. He's, like I just said, the most likely player to be in an optimal lineup across the board. It's just that that ownership is a lot. And so it doesn't mean that you shouldn't play him or you can't play him, he's a bad play, whatever. It means that where you are playing him, you are just going to need to be more aware of the ownership and finding creative ways to be different if you're trying to avoid, being duped a ton. But in terms of him being optimal versus his ownership, I think the ownership's too high across the board.
Yeah, no, it seems too high to me also. So on the same page there. Stephen points out that in 4 of the past 5 games, I mean, you just look at the yardage for Bo Nix in recent weeks. I'll just read off the past 5 weeks. 5 yards, -5 yards, 36 yards, and 4 yards over the past 5 games. So not really running recently, which is pretty interesting because prior to that, the 2 games prior to that, 75 yards and 61 yards on the ground. So hard to really determine whether this is going to be a trend going forward that he's not running, or if that's just kind of a small sample size thing. We know that he has it in his bag. I'm curious what you're seeing as far as stacking goes. Are you getting to a lot of Broncos when you have Bo Nix in the captain spot? Does it look like he's typically stacked, double stacked? What are you seeing there?
The optimal percentages for players in the flex when he's captain are a little bit lower than you see with statue quarterbacks. Courtland Sutton at the top, showing up in the flex spot 60% of the time when Bo Nix is captain. And then it drops off to Javonte Williams at like 44%. And then it goes to guys on Cleveland, Jerry Jeudy, Jameis Winston. So not surprising that like you're still seeing a lot of Courtland Sutton, because that's the other thing here too. Not only does Bo Nix give you some rushing upside at least, so it's not as much a priority to stack him, but you have one guy in Courtland Sutton that draws such a high percentage of targets that he's like the only guy that's really going to stand out as a stacking partner. Now, you do still obviously have the issue that, we talk about a lot and that you mentioned a lot, where even though Courtland Sutton is clearly the number one wide receiver here, if Courtland Sutton has too good of a game, then he's just the captain over Bo Nix. And that's why a lot of times that when you do play a quarterback at captain, even if they run, you're going to want more than one pass catcher, unless it's somebody that is, a threat to like be the number one rusher in the game, kind of like Jaden Daniels or something. But for Bo Nix, you're talking more about somebody that kind of gives you a rushing floor, gives you some rushing upside. But normally, if he's an optimal captain, he probably is also getting it done through the air, in which case you still typically, I think, are going to want more than one pass catcher, but he does at least have that ability to, he gets a rushing touchdown, he runs for 40 yards, and then he peppers Courtland Sutton, and you get a situation where he's the optimal captain. He's also basically the same price as Courtland Sutton. So that's kind of another issue there is it's not like Courtland Sutton's $2,000 more. And even if Bo Nix is just feeding Courtland Sutton, you're gaining elsewhere in your lineup. You couldn't pretty much just flip flop Nix and Sutton if that's the case.
Right. Makes it tougher. So I'm probably always stacking with at least one stacking partner, and they also do have, like, if you look at the recent game log, like it is pretty spread out at least. So I think that's a bonus for like if you want to not stack him as much, hope that he does, get back to that 60 rushing yards type game, and then also spreads it around to his 5 or 6 different receivers and a couple different tight ends. So it's possible for him to spread it out more than he has been. But yeah, it seems like Sutton is a priority for him. I don't know. I think I probably always want Bo Nix stacked, regardless of where he is in the lineup. And at least I think just single stacked at captain. I probably am not going to force a double stack for Bo Nix at captain, because he does have that, some rushing upside. But it's an interesting one because the trend has been not rushing at all recently. And he peppers Courtland Sutton. So I guess my takeaway is if he's not rushing as much recently and he's peppering Courtland Sutton, seems like he's going a little bit too high owned in the captain spot, just given how he's been playing recently.
And the other thing to add here too is, I pointed out the individual player optimal percentages in the flex when he's a captain. I didn't, to your point about there being a ton of like other options as your second pass catcher. All of Vele, Franklin, Mims, and Humphrey show up basically between like 20 and 32% of the time. So that does tell me that there's probably a lot of, double stacked or even triple stacked lineups there. It's just that beyond Courtland Sutton, there's not one clear second guy that you want to pair him with.
Right. But overall, I mean, we're seeing 80 some percent ownership on Bo Nix. 85% ish ownership on Bo Nix. Which is just 86%. Too much, in my opinion. I'm not going to have 86% Bo Nix. There are certainly ways for it to fail. So I'll be underweight there pretty clearly. And then Jameis Winston coming in at so we see 36% going to Bo Nix, just 7% going to Jameis Winston here at captain. In the flex, Jameis Winston getting 41% ownership. Both those numbers seem much more reasonable to me. How much Jameis are you getting too?
So Jameis, I think, is going under-owned at captain, over-owned at flex, which is more in line with kind of how quarterbacks usually look for me, but really makes sense in the context of Bo Nix. And then also just thinking about these two quarterbacks, similar salary. Jameis is a little bit cheaper than Nix by $400 on DraftKings. I have him at 49% projected ownership at flex, 8% at captain. I have him optimal at captain 13% and then optimal at flex 46%. And it just makes sense that with all this ownership going into Bo Nix, that it does open the door for Jameis to be under-owned at captain. And they're not entirely different quarterbacks. Like, we know Jameis isn't giving you a ton of rushing upside, but like you said, there are questions about exactly how much you're getting from Bo Nix at this point. And, it's not like he's just a lock to run for 40 yards or anything. Could he? Sure. But, he also could just run for 5, like we've seen a lot recently. So, I don't think that the median rushing outcome is that different between the two. Obviously, Jameis will go back there and throw. You're also, in some ways, I think missing Cedric Tillman makes Jameis a little bit easier to play a captain. Like, obviously you would prefer him not be missing one of his best pass catchers, but it does kind of narrow down the target distribution, make it more likely that you're right when you play him at captain. You know who to play him with. And, it does take a good receiver off the board as far as somebody you could play. So I think Jameis going under on the captain here relative to Nix. I'll be interested to see if that kind of changes throughout the day, or if it just ends up being, even that ownership projections are wrong and the field plays it closer to right. But right now, I would just rather be playing more Jameis at captain and less Nix.
Okay. Michael Armstrong says, being just barely over or underweight everyone is just doing what everyone else will do, right? Especially if you aren't playing 1,000 lineups.
No, it doesn't matter at all. Total player exposures is basically irrelevant. You can make lineups. There's so many like lineups that have a positive expectation that you can choose to play, that the player exposures you're playing is basically an exercise in portfolio management, not in winning, like not in increasing your chances of winning that DFS slate necessarily. So that's something to keep in mind when you're watching these shows. If you're looking at other players' exposures, like you can look at really good players and how they play large field tournaments, and you're going to have some that end up a lot more concentrated, taking really big stands on some guys, and others that end up a lot flatter. And it's mostly just where those people are choosing to be in terms of risk tolerance and portfolio management. It's not anything to do with like their chances of winning, because within those individual lineups, you can still find guys that are under-owned and be contrarian within those lineups, while still from a broader standpoint being pretty close to the field. So a lot of players, myself included, what ends up happening is we're looking to exploit the field's mistakes, but the field in 2024 isn't making a ton of mistakes. You have really good sim products, you have really good optimizers, people are getting better at using them. So the field's making fewer mistakes, which means that there's just going to be fewer spots that you can exploit. Like if, so like for me, I generally end up being pretty close to the field on most plays. And then there will be a few that, I'm way over or way under. But it's not that I'm like looking to match the field overall. It's that there's not a lot of glaring mistakes being made by the field. So when I take this big bucket of lineups that I think are lineups that can make money, and then I figure out which ones I want to play, a lot of times I end up around, by the end of it, I'm around the field on most guys, because there's not that many players that are standing out as like, this player should be 15% owned and he's 5%. So his lineup is really shooting to the top.
Is Adam frozen for you guys? I'm not hearing, or I just heard something. Okay, you're back for me. I don't know. You were frozen for me for like.
I disappeared on my screen for a second, like right after I stopped talking. I don't know if you heard everything.
Okay, I heard most of what you said. I'm trying to think of where exactly you left off. You're in the middle of a great soliloquy. Is that I don't know if that's the right word. You were going off, and it was good. But yeah, I don't know exactly where we lost you. But
moral of the story, and this is something that like we've talked about a lot in content at Endgame on like roundtables, because it's one of the most common questions that people ask and want to talk about. It's really a portfolio management thing. It's not a necessarily DFS thing. Like most good players, if they thought that a player was going to be 1% owned, that they thought should be 50% owned, they would play 100% of that guy.
Yeah.
But those spots just don't really exist all that much in current day DFS. So it kind of just becomes, do you want, from a risk tolerance standpoint, are you looking to just like really jam in what you think are small edges in player level exposure, or are you taking a step back and kind of minimizing risk a little bit by being more diverse and not attacking like super small edges in some individual players, and kind of just looking at it more from like a lineup level standpoint, and playing, positive lineups still that are just more diverse.
Right. And I feel like it's an easier concept for like to talk about with like best ball, because I think that it's more exploitable from a like lineup construction standpoint than DFS is. Like DFS still exploitable from a lineup construction standpoint, but like best ball, I think that like, some people will say like you're paying the rake if you just have really flat exposure in best ball. You're just paying the rake, and I think that's totally wrong, because so much of the field is making mistakes in terms of lineup construction, more so than player exposures. Like where like ADP is, I mean, it didn't feel very efficient this year, but like generally ADP has gotten much better. But then you still have people drafting 4 quarterbacks or 4 tight ends or whatever. So you just kind of exploit those mistakes that people are making. And if you just build good, well-constructed lineups, let the field make mistakes in terms of lineup construction. I think it also applies to DFS, like you're saying, like you can make great lineups with players that are even like popular players. I got the question in my Discord: do I set a cap on like an ownership cap in my lineups for Showdown? And my answer is I don't set any kind of cap on the ownership in Showdown contests, because you can make a lineup with, you know, all like fairly popular players and leave 1,200 on the table, and you're avoiding dupes, and you still have like a, you know, really nicely, you can correlate it correctly, obviously, like pair your quarterback with a stacking partner and still make a lineup that's not duped 100 times, and you're, you know, gaining on the field there.
Right. Like if you like to go back to this question, you know, you said, especially if you aren't playing 1,000 lineups, think about this from like a macro standpoint. If you're playing 5 lineups, and how what you're saying, like, it actually doesn't have any impact on anything. Like, let's say you play, so the field's playing Bo Nix 60% of the time, and at flex, and you happen to have Bo Nix in 3 of your 5 lineups, so you're at 60%. Whether or not you have an advantage on the field in those lineups has to do with what the rest of your lineup looks like, and whether that lineup is going to win at, or not even win because of dupes and everything, whether or not when that lineup wins and how often it wins, if you're going to profit money or not. And that doesn't have anything to do with whether your other 4 lineups have Bo Nix in all of them or 0 of them. It doesn't matter. Like, you can find 5 lineups that none of them have Bo Nix that are good lineups. You can find 5 lineups that all have Bo Nix that are profitable lineups. And it doesn't matter that you have him in those other 4 or don't have him in those other 4 outside of the portfolio management aspect of it.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So I think that answers that question from Michael pretty well. And of course, I talk a lot about my player exposures, because like it is like part of what I'm doing in ways like trying to get different, is like trying to manage like where I think the field can be exploited in terms of making mistakes. But then even the way I play, it's like I end up being about even with the field on like 90% of plays, and then finding like the few areas where I'm like, I feel like there's input volatility in what the field is doing here. So then I end up, you know, making some stands here or there, but ultimately, I think just being overweight or underweight, and even if you can't find those spots where you do think the field is making mistakes, then just like, all right, well then I'll just make lineups that correlate the way that I think they should, that find, you know, different ways to get unique, and still have about even exposure with the field.
Yeah, and Michael's point about getting the most combos of those, like it is viable and it's an approach, and I'm not saying that he's doing this incorrectly. Like he said, he's having success with it, which is really all that matters. And again, it's you can find good players that are doing this pretty much anywhere along the curve of, you know, how you can handle portfolio management. But the kind of broader misconception that you hear a lot is, well, I want, like, if I'm right, I want to be right and kind of like make sure that I win. And realistically, less so in Showdown, but still in Showdown, like there are so many variations of things you can do. Like if you say, you know, Jameis Winston is the captain, there's still so many different versions of Jameis Winston captain lineups that you can feel like you're kind of like cornering them. And obviously the more you play, the better chance you have of winning if Jameis is the optimal captain, but like you're not coming close to cornering them.
Right.
Not saying, you know, that's exactly what you're suggesting, but it is something that it always comes up in these conversations about, you know, how the correct way to handle this. And it's, you know, it's very similar to how people say, oh, well, if you play 150 lineups, you just play every combination. And it's like, yeah, there's a million combinations. It's
Right.
not a drop in the bucket. It's the same kind of thing where, yeah, your chances obviously improve if you hit that one piece right, but like you're still not cornering anything.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly. I mean, you see people even with like the backup quarterback, when they play that angle, it's like, oh, this backup quarterback totally unowned, like I'm going to crush. And then it's like, well, you're still like, there's still so many lineups you can make, and there are going to be other people with it.
Right. It's kind of the point I was making with why I think Jameis is actually a little bit better option at captain because of Cedric Tillman being out. It's just kind of one less, well, what if he's the captain, but it goes this way,
Right.
option that you have to consider.
Yeah, true. All right. And then, I guess I've got notes in terms of the schedule adjusted matchups. The Broncos defense has allowed the 9th fewest schedule adjusted fantasy points to quarterbacks per game over the past 5 weeks. So a sort of bad matchup for Jameis Winston, bottom 9 matchup over the past 5 weeks. And then the Browns defense has allowed the 11th most schedule adjusted fantasy points per game to quarterbacks over the past 5 weeks. So a slight positive for Bo Nix in that regard. All right, let's move on to running backs. And at running back, top projection goes to Javonte Williams. There are a lot of aspects of this slate that it's like kind of murky. But Javonte Williams has the top projection here. He's only 6,800. Actually, I should make sure that is the case on both sites. Let's see. Nick Chubb, the higher projection at Roto Grinders than Javonte Williams, kind of up in the air. Let's start with the Broncos side of things. Javonte Williams projected for 37% ownership in the flex. At captain, Javonte Williams projected for 10% ownership. Honestly, I have not figured out what I'm doing with Javonte Williams and the Broncos backfield. How much are you getting to of Javonte?
What did you say you had him projected for at captain or Roto Grinders?
10% at captain.
Okay, so I have he's at 8 in the stuff I ran, and I think that's too high too. I have him going pretty over-owned at captain by a similar amount to Bo Nix relative to the field. I think that 38% flex ownership is pretty much efficient. That's where he should be. But I do think he's going over-owned the captain. And I think that makes sense just from a standpoint of you have a really, really messy backfield here. So it's not even like he's guaranteed to be the number one back or the number one goal line back or anything. He obviously can have a good game. But even when he has a good game, like he's still competing with plenty of other, good players, the quarterbacks, Sutton, Jeudy, and Njoku, as far as like guys that have the best game. Take not super cheap at 6,800. So I think he's a perfectly fine play overall, but I do prefer him at flex relative to captain.
Yeah, let's take a look at the usage of the Broncos backfield, because it's kind of interesting. Like we had the 1 week where it looked like, oh, it's Autocast May time. Autocast May is taking over. There was some positive coach speak there. Estime had 14 carries in week 10 to
the minute Sean Payton talks you up, you're not a thing.
Really, I like that seems to be the actual case. Because it seemed really positive for Autocast May. But then the past couple of weeks it has been back to Javonte Williams leading the backfield, 9 carries in week 11, and then another 8 in week 12. So leading the backfield, but also like not great, not much usage there for Javonte Williams. Then 3 targets last week, 29.5% route participation. It's murky there. So I'm with you. It seems like he's getting too much ownership. Probably in both, like at least a captain. I guess he is cheap enough that maybe it's not too much in the flex, because he does appear to be the lead back and he's only 6,800. So maybe 37%. I guess I have no real issue with that. But captain ownership seems too much. How much are you getting to in the flex?
38%. So basically the same as the field there. Like from a projection standpoint, he projects very similarly to Nick Chubb, who's more expensive. He projects very similarly to Elijah Moore, who's $1,000 more expensive. So I do think that in the context of the slate as a whole and the options you have, he looks fine, but particularly at flex, it's not like we're on a slate where you can question Javonte Williams' role and exactly how good he's going to do, but you are really, really sure about the production and role of a bunch of other guys. It's not that kind of slate. So everybody kind of has these question marks. In Nick Chubb's case, it's talent and role. In Javonte's case, it's obviously role with a lot of different options. Like Bo Nix can steal touchdowns too, which obviously would hurt even if Williams didn't have other guys to contend with. But yeah, I still think like he's fine, but it's definitely somebody I prefer more at flex than a captain.
Yeah, same page.
Which the way my last month has gone, pretty much.
Don't do what Adam's doing.
Jam him at captain.
Right. I mean, me too. It's been at least the past couple of weeks has been not great.
Yeah, I'm in one of those stretches where like the second I like clearly say I don't like doing this, I'm pretty sure I know what's going to happen.
Yeah. No, me too. It's been a brutal stretch. Over the past 2 weeks, Javonte Williams has been leading the committee, 17 carries the past 2 weeks. So even leading the committee, that's just my notes, and 8 targets on 30.4% route participation. Bad matchup here. Browns defense has allowed the 3rd fewest schedule adjusted fantasy points per game to running backs over the past 5 weeks. So not a great matchup, not a great role. I don't know. Just seems a bit too much. 10% at captain and probably even like 8% that you say that you have in your stuff.
Yeah. And also like the route participation is down at least a little bit too. 29.5% last week, 31 the week before that, 24 the week before that. Week 9, he was at 50%. Mid-30s in weeks 8 and 7, 58.5% week 6. So like he's still running more routes than the other running backs, but we did see Julian McLaughlin jump to 18% last week after being at 6% in each of the previous 2 weeks. His best skill set is being a pass catcher, so that does stand out to me as something that wouldn't be surprising if that's a trend that continues, where he is just like a pass catching back going forward. That's kind of how he was expected to be used. That's how he had been being used earlier in the year. So I do think, just kind of to add to the conversation about the volatility around Javonte Williams, you did see a small difference in route participation last week going to the guy that should be running more routes.
Yeah. Wait, I'm only seeing 18.2% going to Jaleel McLaughlin last week. He was at 6% the week prior. So yeah, it's I guess it's all relative there. Yeah, no,
Yeah, he's
that
at
it would
6%
make sense.
the 2 weeks before that.
Yeah. So it would make sense for Jaleel to be more of the pass catching back here. Let's get into it with Jaleel McLaughlin and Audric Estime. I guess let's do Jaleel first. How do you feel about? I guess we should take a look at the ownership on Jaleel McLaughlin in the flex, getting 26% ownership. At captain, Jaleel McLaughlin getting probably not anything worth even mentioning here, but let's see. I am missing him. Where is it? Oh, here. 4% ownership. So he is actually getting a bit of captain ownership. So about 30% total ownership going to Jaleel McLaughlin. I don't know. The role has not been awesome in recent weeks. How much do you get into of McLaughlin?
I think he's going over owned. It kind of he's relatively expensive. Like he's not a 2K guy, even though he's had a 2K role basically for the last, I don't know, half of the season. So I think this is one of those spots where, like, if he were low owned, I'd be pretty interested in saying, look, we have no idea how this backfield's going to look in a 1-game sample. We know that he can catch passes. We know that they've used him, around the goal line at times this year. So let's take some chances on him. But projected for, I have it at 1% captain ownership, which I think is about right, if not even a little bit too high. 12% flex ownership. It's like, okay, the field is already taking this angle. I think there's a little bit more of an advantage in just taking the approach of assuming the status quo and saying, what if he just keeps having the role that he's had, looking back every recent week, and that's just his role. Like, I think there's more of an advantage in doing that at this point.
Yeah, no, that's probably true when you look at ownership. Yes, because like on the one hand, I come into this and like one point I was going to make is like with Sean Payton, you just like never know. Like the week that Audric Estime got 14 carries randomly, like was out of nowhere. I mean, there prior to that, there wasn't much coach speak saying that he was going to be the lead back. Maybe there was a little bit, but like he's so unpredictable. But if the field is going to lean into the unpredictability more than they should, then it's like, well, then I guess I'll just play the guys who are like have been having good roles and are most likely going to retain those good roles instead of just like jumping the gun and being like, whatever, it's probably just going to be Jaleel McLaughlin this week. So I think that makes sense.
Right. I mean, this is, obviously you don't choose players by looking at game logs, but this is a spot where if he's actually going to be 10 to 15% owned at 4,800, take a step back and realize this guy has exceeded 8 fantasy points twice all season long. And there's nothing to suggest that he's going to have a drastically different role this week based on what we've seen. I mentioned his route participation last week being up. It was up from 6%. Like it was 18.
Right.
He still wasn't running a lot of routes. He was targeted, I think, once last week and not targeted at all in either of the 2 games. Like the most likely outcome here is still that this guy just doesn't have a big role. And at his price tag, it's not a matter of, well, his role was a little bit bigger than I thought it would be. He needs an actual role here to be a good play or to, just catch 2 passes at the goal line.
Yeah. Yeah, seems a bit high there. With that said, Audric Estime, I just pulled up the Coach Speak Index Discord. Just wanted to see if we have anything on that I'm missing in terms of the running backs. I'm not seeing anything on Jaleel McLaughlin. I am seeing on the 25th. So again, this might be a death knell here for Audric Estime. He said, we're excited about Audric Estime's future. I got to continue to find ways to get him more touches. So we got to X out Audric Estime. I think they say they want to get him more touches. We're going to see 0 touches for Audric Estime in this game. That is worth noting. I'm half kidding, guys.
Yeah, I mean that's the strongest case I've heard made for Jaleel McLaughlin yet.
Yeah, right. If they say they want to play more Audric Estime, so it is wheels up for Jaleel McLaughlin. Let's see. Oh, and then another quote later on said, I'm glad we're not getting toward the end of the season and not knowing about some of these rookies. Now with Audric, I've got to continue to find his role. So repeated that he really needs to get Audric Estime involved. I mean, I'm like mostly kidding that this is bad news for Audric Estime, but man, Sean Payton has a bad track record. How we feeling about? I guess I should look at the ownership for Audric Estime in the flex, getting 18% ownership. At captain, Audric Estime getting, where are we?
Should be in the ones.
2% ownership.
Yeah.
So how are we feeling about Audric Estime around 20% total ownership?
I think that's insane. The ownership projection I have is like 9% at flex and 1 at captain, which I think is about correct. So if by the time we get to lock, ownership projections are more in line with what you have right now, then I pretty clearly think he's a bad play. At around 8, 9, 10% ownership, I think it's perfectly fine. Just because at that ownership and at 4K, you're just kind of embracing the variance there, and hopefully either A, he has a bigger role, or B, he just gets touches in high value areas. But overall, he's priced up enough. He's a $2,000 running back priced at 4K that will have some ownership because, one, there's just not a lot of good plays on this slate, and two, people just want to be right and say that they got low owned 4K Audric Estime when he was the lead back, which he probably won't be, but could be.
Yeah, it's hard because there's nothing that I want to do as a result of that. Like, oh, well, then I'm going to lean into Javonte Williams because it's just like, looks like it's a committee. It's kind of gross. None of them all that exciting.
My overall takeaway here is that Javonte Williams is pretty much correctly owned, but over-owned at captain. Jaleel McLaughlin's over-owned, particularly at flex, but he's not owned the captain either. So, I think he's the most over-owned of the three.
Yeah.
And then Estime, again, is just correctly owned across the board with not a ton of ownership. With the ownership that I mentioned, with yours, he's way over-owned.
I feel like I don't hate it as much as you do. So 20% total ownership going to Estime, because I'm a sucker for coach speak. I think I'm a little bit like, well, maybe, and we had the game where he had 14 carries a couple weeks ago, so that could happen. But yeah,
what does 14 carries from Audric Estime even get you though? He's not catching passes.
True. I mean that's a good point. Yeah. I mean, if I knew he was going to get 14 carries at 4K, I would have a lot of him. But
sure, yeah.
Again, that's probably the best case scenario for Audric Estime. So, yeah, you're probably right. 20% is too much. I'm not like that's egregious. I think it's levels of. I don't think 20% is egregious for Audric Estime, but I think it's too much. All right. So yeah.
Again, not to game log watch, but the game you're hoping, the opportunities, not the game, but the opportunities that you're praying for. If you play Audric Estime, netted him 5.3 DraftKings points when he got them.
Yeah.
So my point here is, obviously, like you said, if you knew going in that he gets 14 carries, you're slamming him in at 4K because there's a decent chance at least one of those carries ends up in the end zone, etc. But you're not, because he's not a pass catching back. If you don't play him or you err on the side of not having a lot of him, you also have those outs where even if you're wrong and he is the guy, he still just has a bad game because he's just running and that's all he's doing.
No, I mean that is definitely true. I agree with you that he's over-owned. I'm just not quite to the extent of that's bad shit. I think it's more like that's bad, but
to be clear, 20% I think is crazy. 10%, cool.
Yeah. 10% to me seems reasonable. That's probably efficient. Maybe even I think I would, if you were going to come in at 10%, I would probably want more. But it's also, I think part of the reason that I don't hate as much as you do is there's not that much that I like on this slate that I'm like, oh, that seems great. I really want to be over the field there. So then it's I guess you can make a case for it. So I don't know, more okay with it, but also largely on the same page that it's, if he does get 20%, it'd be too much.
So to put this in context, just within the slate and even the position, Jerome Ford is $4,400, and I have him projected for 12% captain ownership right now. So slightly higher than Estime, but projected for twice the fantasy points. So I would, and not that I think Ford's a great player or anything, but if I'm playing somebody in this price range, I would just so much rather be getting to him.
Wait, 12% flex ownership, you mean?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, no, I agree with you there. So I guess maybe that's a good point.
I think Ford is basically twice as good a play as Audric Estime.
Yeah. No, I think I agree with you there. So I guess there is one play that looks significantly better than Audric Estime. All right. You've convinced me a little bit that it's maybe more batshit at 20% than I'm giving it credit for. But at 10%, I think I would be, I might even come in overweight to the field if he does come in at 10%. I don't know. It's a tough one. But so I guess that does finish it out for the Broncos. So let's move on to, because I assume you're not, are you getting to any Michael Burton?
No. 2% chance of being optimal, 1% ownership. So, I mean, no, but he's in the bucket of, if you need a 4K guy, he's breathing.
Yeah, 400. 2 targets over the
Yeah.
past 2 weeks, 3
Not 4K.
carries.
Yeah.
Yeah. Seems like playable, but not exciting. Um, Nick Chubb, he is back. He is super inefficient. He's 9,400, but he had 19 carries last week. Chubb coming in at 32% ownership in the flex. At captain, Chubb coming in at just 1% ownership. What do you have his captain ownership at?
3.
3 seems better. Like 1%, even as bad as he has been.
Yeah, I think they're both too low.
Yeah.
Like both in terms of where they should be and where they probably come in. He's still
Yeah.
$9,400. He's still the lead running back. People are still going to click him. I think he ends up at like 5-6%. I think his optimal captain rate is about 6%. So again, this is one of those spots where it's early enough in the day where if people are using ownership projections saying he's going to be 1 to 3% owned at captain, he's actually going to be like 9%,
Right.
because everybody that uses any sort of Sims tools or ownership in general is going to play him. The optimal spot, I think, is around 6. Assuming that ownership just kind of adjusts throughout the day, he probably comes in at 5 or 6%.
I think you're probably right about that. Like 1%, there's no way it comes in at 1%. 3% I could see, but like you're probably right, probably more like 5 or 6%, which I would probably just try to match the field there. Like no real stand there.
He's just an easy one to click to because he has name recognition. He had a good game the last time the Browns were on a showdown slate. Like people that played that slate remember seeing, oh yeah, Nick Chubb's like near the top. Yeah, it's just an easier one to click. Like you feel good about clicking him, even though he's sucked this year.
It was just last week too. This game against Pittsburgh was Thursday Night Football. I was all in on Jerome Ford in that game, and that did not go well. He did not have the role I was hoping for. Yeah, I mean, captain ownership definitely too low. Flex ownership at 32%. That seems fair. Like I don't think that I want any more than that. I don't know. Do you like him better than I do?
No.
Okay.
The flex ownership number I have is only 24%, and I think he's going over-owned.
Okay. Yeah. So you have him under-owned at captain, under-owned in the over-owned in the flex.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, he's not been good. Like, he got 19 carries, so that's the case you can make for him. Is this is a game where we don't have many players who are getting any kind of volume, and he had 19 carries last week. They seem to really want him to be a thing, want him to be their lead back. But yeah, 32% seems a bit high. 24%, I don't know. That's closer to okay for me.
Yeah, I mean, the thing with Nick Chubb here, the case you make for him is you can get into the efficiency numbers all you want, but really all that you're doing there, obviously it impacts how you're projecting him. But mostly what you're doing there is you're just saying this isn't Nick Chubb from pre-injury, which he's not, but like Nick Chubb pre-injury would never be $9,400 on a showdown slate. The big thing here is that the Browns don't seem to know or care that it isn't Nick Chubb from pre-injury, and they are just kind of doing the same. Like I was just saying, it's comfortable to click on him at captain because people know, he has name value. The Browns coaching staff so far is doing the same thing. They're ignoring all metrics of how he's actually performing, and they're saying, we have Nick Chubb on our roster. That means we're going to give him the ball 15 to 20 times. And until that changes, he's going to look decent.
Yeah, that's pretty valuable.
Especially like he's getting goal line carries.
As Steven said this last Thursday, he said, I mean, he can fall in the box twice, which I agree with. Like, yeah, he's going to be their goal line back almost certainly. So it happened on last Thursday. Could obviously happen again. Like at 9,200 on this slate, I think like that definitely would be optimal. Not necessarily at captain. Sorry, 9,400. Not necessarily at captain, but like he would be optimal somewhere because I don't think this is a slate where we're going to have a ton of scoring. So
like so much of NFL DFS is the meme with like the really dumb person and then the 80% in the middle and then the really smart person doing the same thing as the dumb person. Like so much of NFL DFS is just opportunity, and you have the 80% doing what we're doing, and like Fantasy Points has great data about anything you could ever want to find and digging into all of that stuff. And at the end of the day, it's just they're going to throw him the ball a lot, or he's going to get handed the ball a lot, and that's like 95% of what you need to know and keep in mind when actually making lineups.
Yep, exactly. Jerome Ford, we talked about it a little bit. Ford coming in the flex at, where are we? Maybe we got to sort by ownership.
Who are you looking for?
Jerome Ford.
Oh, I have it at like 12% flex and 1% captain.
Oh, yeah, 12% flex ownership for Jerome Ford. I think that's what you said also. How much do you have a captain?
12. 1.
Okay, yeah, and so 0% captain ownership here obviously is going to get some. You already said you like to play. That seems like a phenomenal play to me. No disagreement there. Do you want to tell me how much you're getting?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't know how much I'm getting, but as far as optimal rate goes, I have him optimal in the flex 15 to 16% of the time. So going pretty under owned there. I have him optimal at captain 1 to 2%, which is slightly above where he's projected to be. The big difference here, Ford versus Estime, is in this price range. That's why I use him as the example, but also compared to like McLaughlin, is he kind of has the role that Julia McLaughlin should have, or that you would think he would have. You're actually seeing Ford in that role. Like, he's running more routes than Nick Chubb is. 48% route participation last week, if I remember correctly, somewhere in that range. Only had like a 4% target share. But yeah, 48% route participation last week, 51% the week before that. Week 9, didn't play week 10. Week 9, 53.5%. So since coming back from injury, 53.5%, 51%, 48% route participation. He's on the field running routes. We're talking about full PPR on DraftKings. If he gets carries, if he just starts cutting into Nick Chubb's rushing workload, obviously that's like icing on the cake. But he can just get there, or at least give you a decent score just based on catching passes potentially. Again, not getting targeted a ton, but he's at least on the field. He's running routes, and that just increases his projection enough to where he looks like a better option to me. Like, Audric Estime probably needs and this is, just kind of off the top of my head, but like from a projection standpoint, you would need Audric Estime to get 8 to 10 carries probably just to like be the equivalent of Jerome Ford running routes on half of Jameis's dropbacks.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the running routes obviously targets is what you really want more so than
right,
routes.
Yeah.
But like, we assume that routes lead to targets. That's so much
for a
more
running
valuable.
back, like, you're catching most of your targets because they're low ADOT.
Short,
so like,
yeah.
I mean, for Estime to get, so let's say like 2 catches for Jerome Ford is probably 6 carries for Audric Estime.
Yeah, no, it's so much more valuable to get those the PPR points, and has, I think, the same, like, definitely has probably even more contingent upside also than Audric Estime, because if something happened to Javonte Williams, then it's like, okay, Estime is splitting with Jaleel McLaughlin in a tough matchup. Whereas if something happened to Nick Chubb, then it's like, we've seen it with Jerome Ford. Like, he's just the bell cow in that scenario. So yeah, just seems like a much better play overall.
And then also, like, we're focusing on the receiving aspect for Ford. And then, obviously, like you said, the contingent value. By the way, 25% rushing market share 2 weeks ago, 15% last week. Estime 13% last week, 23% the week before. They're getting like the same rushing workload. And then Ford's just involved in the passing game. Estime is not. Ford has no other running backs to compete, like Pierre Strong, to compete with if Chubb gets hurt. Estime may or may not be the next guy up if Williams gets hurt. Like, the only thing that I can point to that Estime has in his favor is there is a greater chance that the Broncos just go into this game with Estime as their running back 1 and nobody knows
without telling anybody.
Than that the Browns do. But I don't think that's a particularly high chance.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. Like, because Sean Payton is so unpredictable, and like, I almost feel like intentionally unpredictable, where it's just like he just does random shit like that. There is some chance of that happening, whereas there's zero chance that it's just like Jerome Ford is the lead back, because they not zero chance. I shouldn't say that. I thought it might happen last week. I was like, I mean, maybe they just will give up on this Nick Chubb experiment because he's rushing for 3 yards per carry, but I think it's pretty unlikely after like they continued running him 19 times last week. Kind of seems like they really want him to be a thing. So feels pretty unlikely
based on who it is, based on what we've seen. If you turn the game on tonight and you see Estime on the field for the first snap with the Broncos, your thought is just going to be like, oh, Sean Payton's doing this shit again. Yep. If you see Jerome Ford on the field ahead of Nick Chubb, it's going to be like, oh my God, what is happening? Like, that's shocking.
Did Nick Chubb get hurt and they didn't tell us? What's going on here? Yeah. Do we talk about all of the? Yeah, we talked about all of. I assume, are you getting to any Pierre Strong at 1,400?
I would assume I am not. Like, that's not a free price tag. Where is? Oh, there he is. Yeah, no, I am not.
Yeah,
I didn't scroll down far enough. I couldn't even find him.
He had 2 carries last week, 0 targets on 2 routes run. The week prior, 0 targets on 8 routes run, 2 carries. So I guess he has a non-zero role, but
yeah,
pretty
it's
minimal.
the price. Like
Yeah,
when
yeah.
in my stuff, I use 1% as like the minimum ownership that I can project to anybody, because if I start getting at flex, because if I start having decimals, it just throws things off. And a lot of times, guys just end up being 1% kind of by default. But I have strong going over owned at that 1% minimum.
Yeah. Yeah, that seems about right. All right, let's move on to wide receivers. Move over here. Courtland Sutton, the pretty clear top receiver on the slate. Let's take a look at the ownership. Sutton in the captain spot is getting 17% ownership. In the flex, Sutton getting 43% ownership, so around 60% total ownership on Courtland Sutton. We don't have many sure things on this slate in terms of usage. Feels like Courtland Sutton is a pretty sure thing in terms of usage. How do you feel about 60% total ownership? And what's your breakdown of captain versus flex?
I think it's a little overowned, but not by as big a margin as Bo Nix, I don't think. At captain, I have him similarly overowned to Nix. At flex, I think he's more efficiently owned. I have him 43% optimal at flex, 10.5% at captain. He is one of the only sure things on the slate, as you said, in terms of opportunities. Going to get targeted a lot, pretty much always does. What he does with those, who knows? It's been an above average matchup so far this year, fantasy matchup for wide receivers against Cleveland. The big question, is always how much time is the line able to afford the quarterback against Cleveland's pass rush? Cleveland generally, like I don't have the current number, the up-to-date numbers in front of me, but for the most part this season, they've been like the lowest too high look defense in the league. They put a lot, on their corners, just assuming that they're going to get to the quarterback. And so, a lot of it comes down to that. Like Sutton's probably going to have a pretty good amount of man coverage, one-on-one coverage, if they're able to protect Bo Nix. And in that case, everything's going to look really good for Sutton because he's a good receiver and he's going to get a lot of targets. But you do run the risk of Nix just being under pressure a lot. And also, like Nix has played pretty well. This is still a rookie quarterback. There are just going to be games where Nix isn't on the same page as his receivers and just is missing Sutton and all of that. So, I think that the fact that he is the most sure thing as far as opportunities goes is kind of in some ways a negative when you're talking about a showdown slate like this, where it's really, really tough for people to click in a lineup that 6 times says, I don't want Courtland Sutton, because like he's one of the only guys you can remotely feel good about. So right. I do think he's going a little bit overowned. But that said, just like with Bo Nix, just like with these other guys at the top, he's still clearly one of the most likely guys to succeed. 43% flex optimal percentage, 10 to 11% at captain. So one of the most likely guys to succeed. I think the most likely non-quarterback to succeed. So, if you just go into this slate saying, well, I'm not going to play anybody that I think is overowned, then for me, I can't play anybody at flex until we get down to like Valet. So it's, a matter of finding ways to make lineups that as a whole aren't going overowned. Courtland Sutton, obviously, is still going to be a big part, but, I don't think that the field's making any mistakes as far as not playing him enough.
Yeah. Agree with you there. I pulled up, this is the coverage matchup tool, wide receiver cornerback matchups. I think this is free at fantasypoints.com if anybody wants to check it out, but looks like it's just a positive matchup across the board for Denver receivers regardless. I don't know, like I'm curious where you end up, like who you have as underowned at captain, because I see the number on
underowned at captain, a lot of good players. Underowned at flex, a lot of bad players.
Okay, all right. Because you have both Bo Nix and Courtland Sutton under. I guess we haven't gotten to a lot of the receivers yet. So
I have the Cleveland offense under on the captain.
Yeah, basically. I think that probably agree with you there. Sutton, good click in general. Looks like slightly overowned at captain, efficiently owned at flex. That sounds about right. Devon Valet. So you said Devon Valet looks good for you. He is 6,400. Valet coming in at captain at 4% ownership. At flex, Valet coming in at 29% ownership. Those seem like under-owned numbers to me. How much are you getting to, or what do you have him as optimal?
So one other, I just got it pulled up. One other thing to point out as far as like a positive for Courtland Sutton and Denver in general, Denver's offensive line has the 5th lowest pressure rate over expectation allowed this season. Cleveland, of course, far and away number 1 in pressure rate over expectation for their defense. So, again, handling Myles Garrett, handling that defensive line is really, really tough. And just because they've had success against other opponents doesn't mean they will today. But they've at least been good against other opponents so far. For Vele, I have him going a little bit under-owned at both flex and captain. 25% projected ownership at flex, 26% optimal rate, 3.5% projected ownership at captain, 3.5% optimal rate. So I think he looks pretty good at 6,400. You do have, from a target standpoint, targets pretty spread out behind Courtland Sutton in this passing game, but route participation had been really good for him. He did drop off a bit last week, 54.5% last week, still second most on the team behind Courtland Sutton. He's run the second most routes on the Broncos each of the last 3 weeks. And it makes sense because he does run the bulk of his routes from the slot, whereas they keep the other guys on the outside. So you have Sutton on the outside, and then you have, Humphrey, Mims, Franklin kind of rotating through, whereas Vele's kind of just keeping slot routes. So whenever they have 3 wide receivers, usually you're going to have him running routes, whereas 2 wide receiver sets and 3 wide receiver sets outside of Courtland Sutton, you're getting varying looks, varying personnel groups with those other guys. So he does look like the second best Broncos wide receiver, but he also is priced to be the second best Broncos wide receiver.
Yeah. Over the past 5 weeks, Cleveland allowing the 6th most schedule adjusted fantasy points per game to slot receivers. So it seems like a good matchup from that perspective for Vele. Like you said, he's got kind of the second best usage of the receivers. I mean, pretty clearly over the past 3 weeks this year, 66.7%, 65.7, 54.5. Even Courtland Sutton is just around 75, 80% route participation. So Vele number 2 by that metric, getting some targets also. Just looking at target share here, it's been pretty good. 21.4% target share in the last game for Vele. That was an interesting one because I was tracking it because I know Derek Brown was really into Vele, and he was like in the first half they were throwing to him over and over, and then I just kind of went away from him in the second half. It seemed like they were like trying to get him the ball early. I think he looks pretty good. Sorry, did you say how much how much you have him optimal?
Basically right around the field on both, a little bit under owned at flex, 26% optimal at flex, 3.5 to 4% at captain.
So you have him projected for lower ownership than 26% in the flex.
25.
Okay. Yeah. Rotogranus has him at 29, which seems fine to me.
Yeah.
And then outside of Sutton and Vele for the Broncos, let's see. We have Marvin Mims, Lil Jordan Humphrey, Troy Franklin. I guess just those 3, but still just it's kind of a mess there. Just looking at the usage trends for the Broncos, there's nobody really separating beyond Courtland Sutton and Devon Vele for me. I don't know if you see anything different for me, different than what I see for Lil Jordan Humphrey, Troy Franklin, Marvin Mims, in terms of excitement to play them. That they all seem kind of throw your hands up in the air, wish for the best. I guess the ownership, Mims coming in 26% flex ownership. Lil Jordan Humphrey coming in at just 13% flex ownership. Troy Franklin, I mean, they're Rotogran's projecting for 2% flex ownership. What kind of ownership numbers are you seeing for these guys?
Yeah, so I was gonna say that's the whole like equation with these 3. I think they project similarly. They are similar salaries. They have similar range of outcomes. You really should, if they're projected for the same ownership, be playing them in similar amounts, unless for some reason you have a reason to like think that this is a Marvin Mims spot or whatever. But assuming you don't, play them in equal amounts. With the way ownership looks right now, I think Troy Franklin's like the best play on the slate. 5 to 6% projected ownership at flex with the sources that I used, compared to 13% for Mims and 12% for Humphrey. So I wouldn't be surprised if that Franklin ownership projection just ends up being in line with Mims and Humphrey by the time we get to lock. But if it doesn't, just play more Troy Franklin and either, around the field on Mims and Humphrey or less of those guys if you need to. I would just take, like, this is one of those spots where if ownership is projected the way that it is, and if like I knew that this is actually ownership, my biggest stand on the slate would probably just be playing Troy Franklin every time I need a cheap player, not because I think like he's a lock to have a good game or anything. It's just that I think that's one of the biggest mistakes the field is projected to make right now, is taking a group of 3 guys that run similar routes, have similar route participation, have similar target shares, are functionally the same play, and for whatever reason saying, well, Humphrey and Mims are good, are guys that we want, and Franklin is guy I don't want. And if that is actually what the field gives you, I would just take the one that they don't want, because they are basically the same thing.
Yeah, definitely 100% on the same page as you there. That I saw that. I was like, that's got to be an error, right? That seems way too low of ownership.
It's either going to change or just be wrong.
Yeah.
There is no way, and this is kind of one of the problems. It's going to be a problem as the field gets better in general, but especially with Sims now too. If the input that everybody uses is that Troy Franklin is just not going to get any ownership, everybody's going to be jamming Troy Franklin.
Every Sims product going to give you all the Troy Franklin.
Right.
Yeah. There is some possibility Josh Reynolds returns. We just got the question will Reynolds play? I think it's more likely that he doesn't play. I think he's being projected out right now because he hasn't played in a few weeks at this point, I think. And I guess I can look at the Josh Reynolds game log.
So I think it's relatively likely he does play, but okay. I do have him projected. He is projected out right now by pretty much everybody because he's still on IR. So obviously if he does come back, it completely changes everything we're saying about the second or third Denver receiver. Reynolds is also 3K, so he would be in that mix. Like, we don't know how much he would play, but I think he would probably play a lot if he does come back, because it was a hand injury and not a lower body injury, and he's been practicing for 3 weeks, or something like that. So I think he probably plays a pretty good amount. Like, he's clearly their second best receiver behind Sutton. I think he probably plays a pretty good amount and would be a really good play if he does play. But until he gets activated, he's just going to be projected out.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. He's still listed questionable. Yeah, the only note I had seen is that he's questionable. Everybody's projecting him out, so I assumed it seemed more doubtful. But yeah, there's nothing. Just looking at some of the news here, seems like it's some like. So you think that it's greater than 50% chance that he plays? I mean, that
it seems that way. The blurb on DraftKings says that he's nearing the end of his activation window. He was a full participant in practice on Saturday. It says logged the third straight full participation in practice Saturday. So yeah, he's been practicing fully. Yeah, I mean, I kind of assume they activate him.
That seems right. So then all these ownership numbers are going to be wrong if he does end up playing, because everywhere is projecting him out. All the projections are wrong. All the ownership numbers going to be wrong. In that case, it's already a super muddy situation. It's just going to be even muddier. And like then if we get Josh Reynolds at 1-2% owned, then suddenly he would be the best play of the group, probably. Like, he would be the one that you want to jam into your lineups instead.
If Reynolds is active, I think he's a great play. Like, it was a broken finger. It wasn't a lower body injury that you have to worry about them being cautious with, or that he couldn't do cardio or whatever. And he's been practicing like the entire time, basically. If you just like scroll down on the DraftKings blurbs, like November 22nd, Reynolds ruled out, but for a second consecutive week, he was a full participant on all 3 Broncos injury reports. Like, he's just been practicing for 3 weeks. It wasn't a lower body injury. He's the best receiver they have, not named Courtland Sutton. He really should not have any issue running routes and taking opportunities away from this whole mix of other bad Denver receivers. Or not good Denver receivers. So like, I think assuming he's active, and that we don't get some report like he's active and not going to play, or active and, they don't want to play him or whatever. Like, I think he's just clearly like the best value on the slate once he gets activated.
Yeah, no, I think you're probably, I mean, we'll have to see what ownership numbers come in at. Maybe if he comes in and he's at 25% immediately, then he wouldn't look as obvious, but probably comes in pretty low owned. That's something that I will break down again 85 minutes prior to lock. I'll be doing another show, so if you want to talk about this more with me when we know the status of Josh Reynolds, I'll be doing that tonight. Kind of hard to break down right now without knowing where the projections come in at, and then the ownership projections come in at. It's hard to know exactly what to expect from the situation, but that is going to make things a bit hairier, regardless. As of right now,
and Jake mentioned that Reynolds was shot also, but again, wasn't shot in the lower body. Like he was shot in the head and the arm. I think he's
fine.
His cardio should be
not
fine.
a big deal. Yeah, no, he's good. We've all been shot. You get through it.
I mean, you just have to hope that he turns into Brian Robinson and not Tank Dell.
I mean, sadly, it seems to be the case. As of right now, Troy Franklin looks awesome. Lil Jordan Humphrey projecting. Man, it's such a tough room to break down. Marvin Mims, Lil Jordan Humphrey. As I said, Marvin Mims projecting for like 25% ownership. Wait, where is he? Yeah, 26% ownership going to Marvin Mims, which kind of stood out to me as like this is target share. Marvin Mims' route participation is sort of insane. His usage, given his route participation he has like 10 targets over the past 3 weeks on 19% route participation. Doesn't seem like he would be good chalk to me. If he comes in with a ton of ownership at 18% route participation, I would probably be inclined to be underweight there.
Who was that?
Marvin Mims.
Okay.
Mims.
Yeah. I mean, if Reynolds is out, I just don't really want whoever the most popular of this group is, and I want more of the one that's not popular. If they're all like 13% owned, I think they're all just like perfectly fine plays.
Yeah, just mix them in. Yeah, I mean, I guess we'll know more later on, but it's sort of tough to break down right now. As of right now, Marvin Mims, I was saying, projected for 26% ownership at Roto Grinders, which seems really
high as far as like what it would be and also where it should be.
Yeah, I would guess it comes in a little bit lighter than that. There is, I guess I'll say this we got the obligatory Sean Payton coach speak for Marvin Mims that we've been getting for 2 years now, or is it just is this a sophomore year or junior? I forget. But regardless, it's been as long as he's been there. We've been getting the Sean Payton coach speak. The latest is on the 27th in the Coach Speak Index Discord. Sean Payton said, Marvin Mims does such a good job running that vision can carry over to certain runs in your offense and certain things in the passing game. It's allowed us to kind of expand some packages with him. On the 29th, offense coordinator Joe Lombardi. So if you trust Lombardi more than Sean Payton, this is worth noting. That expanding Marvin Mims Jr.'s role and letting him do different things, talented player, finding ways to get him the ball is important. And I think we've done a better job of that as of late, and we'll continue to do it. It helps that he's an awfully smart player. So as you give him different personnel packages and ask him to do different things week to week, he picks up on it with no problem. And I guess that like there's truth to that. They have been finding ways to get him the ball. Like he has not been out on the field that much, but he does have 10 targets over the past 3 weeks. So like relative to his route participation, they are actually finding ways to get him the ball. But still 26% just seems too much for somebody who's probably not going to see more than three targets or so in a game, 3-4.
Yeah. And Jake said if Reynolds is in, there's a chance that Mims is inactive, right? Like one of these receivers easily could be inactive if Reynolds is in. There's only been one game this year where Reynolds and Vele were both active. In that game, Troy Franklin either was inactive or ran 0 routes. I assume he was inactive. It was week 1. But you had Sutton run 84% of routes. Reynolds ran 78%. Vele ran 53%. So he ran the most outside of those two, which is what I would expect given that he's the slot receiver. And then you had 28.5% for Humphrey. You had 14% for Mims. I think it's a pretty reasonable breakdown, like similar to what we would expect today if Reynolds is in. Again, like Reynolds has only run 20% of his routes from the slot this year. So I think that you would continue to see Vele be the third receiver as far as route participation. And if Reynolds is back, you're just going to see Mims, Franklin, and Humphrey run fewer routes.
Yeah. Seems right. I mean, there's also some possibility that Reynolds is back, but like they don't give him a full-time role in his first game. I mean, like you said,
it would
like
just be weird. I don't know why they would do that.
Yeah, whip for a finger. Like he's been practicing. We know he can catch. He's also a veteran. Like he's been in the NFL for many years now. So
the Broncos are also 7-5. The case for like bringing Reynolds back and him having a reduced role, given that it wasn't a lower body injury, would be the Broncos are 3-9 and they want to just get more routes. They want to get more playing time for Marvin Mims and these guys. Josh Reynolds is their second best receiver. It's a team with playoff aspirations. He's been practicing for 3 weeks. Didn't have a lower body injury. would defy logic for Josh Reynolds to not just be the number 2 receiver here.
That's true. That is true. Well, we'll know more.
Especially also, like, Josh Reynolds has been out for half the season, and none of these guys have stepped up into the clear wide receiver 2 role. They've had the opportunities to make the coaching staff be like, oh shit, we should have been playing this guy more. Glad we have him. None of them have done that. So
yeah, just get our number 2 receiver back. No, I think you're right about that.
I'm actually curious to see how he's projected, because, like, I think there's a decent chance that if he is active, you see sites kind of project like a huge mess here at wide receiver 2, when I think he's wide receiver 2.
All right, you heard it. Adam's coming back on tonight to talk about this again. No,
this is like, I don't know if they'll project it the same way. This is the Allen Lazard spot from earlier in the season. If sites take the approach of, well, we don't want to be blatantly wrong anywhere, so we're going to just project Reynolds, Humphrey, Mims, whoever's active of that group for like mediocre scores, I think there's a massive edge in saying, no, Josh Reynolds is the guy, and I'm ignoring the rest of this.
Agreed.
I don't know if they'll project it that way, but, kind of like they did with the Jets, the game where everybody was hurt, and it was like, oh, well, it could be Gibson, or it could be Lazard, or it could be whoever. And logic was kind of just like, no, it's going to be Lazard just being out there a ton. This is kind of the same idea, I think.
Yeah. Charlie says, but is Sean Payton logical? So I'm a known Sean Payton hater as a Vikings fan. He taunted us with the skull chant, and then we beat him. But I'm a long time Sean Payton hater. I think that he is fairly logical. I think he's just unpredictable. Like he doesn't really like show us his hand. He's like, I hate him as a coach for people trying to do fantasy analysis, but like I think he does like what's best for his team in general. So I do think he's logical from that standpoint.
He hasn't been like jerking Courtland Sutton's routes around. He's not playing Marvin Mims over Courtland Sutton. And like you can go back and look at, there were 5 games where Reynolds was active. I mentioned week 1, he ran 78% of routes. It dropped to 64% week 2. Humphrey surpassed him at 69%, but Vele was out that week. So I assume Humphrey was running like slot routes and stuff too. Humphrey ran more routes in week 3, but again, Vele was out. Humphrey ran more routes than him in all of weeks 2, 3, 4, and 5. But Reynolds was still at 64%, 51%, 42, 50, and Vele was out. Vele came back. Franklin jumped ahead of Humphrey. Like, I think that Reynolds is, based on what we've seen, the second outside wide receiver.
Yep. I think that makes sense. Okay. Outside of, and again, all of these ownership numbers are going to change. So it's sort of hard to break it down too well as of right now. But Lil Jordan Humphrey finally, as of right now, projected for 13% flex ownership at 3,200. How much do you see? Where do you see optimal numbers for Lil Jordan?
And again, this is all kind of potentially irrelevant, but assuming that Reynolds is out just because he's on IR and that's how he's being projected right now, optimal 11% of the time at flex, 1% at captain. Just very similar to Mims, very similar to Franklin. Always Army said Peyton is starting to open up more to Mims. He's really not. He can say that he is, but he's not. Like, Mims is running less routes than any of these other receivers. He ran routes on 18% of dropbacks last week. He ran routes 20% the week before that, 18% the week before that, sub 10% target rate or target share in 4 of the last 5 games. His high for the season was 3 weeks ago at 13%. Like, if that's opening up to Marvin Mims, like, it's the lowest like bar that you could have.
I mean, you could like from a like they are getting manufacturing touches for him. So I guess from that perspective, like he does have 4 targets in 2 of the past 3 weeks, and that's his most on the season. But man, yeah, like you said, like still like not really not giving him like 8 targets suddenly. It's still pretty. Point is he was not using him at all. Yeah. No, I mean
it's not even true. Week 5, like week 1, 14% routes for Mims, 13% week 2, 28 week 3, didn't play week 4. 28% week 5, 37% week 6, 30% week 7, 26, 31. His route participation in the last 3 weeks is 3 of his 5 lowest marks of the entire season.
Yeah, the route participation way down, the target share, or at least the raw targets are up relative to early weeks. But yeah, not in any kind of massive way. Not a great role for Marvin Mims. Not going to love it if he gets ownership. Lil Jordan Humphrey, I guess we can pull him up. better route participation, 45% last week, 45.5%, 3 targets in that game. Seems like he has the better, like I'd rather bet on the guy with the route participation getting more targets than the guy. That's not true. I guess you could make the bet on the guy who's been getting targets, getting more route participation. So I don't want to say that I'd rather make that bet, but the route participation has been better for Low Jordan Humphrey. I don't know. We'll have to play the ownership game with these guys. None of them have great roles, and Josh Reynolds just going to make things even messier.
It's the ownership game, and then if they are all similarly owned, I think it's like, again, just assuming Reynolds is out. I think it goes Humphrey, Franklin, Mims. Like Humphrey's running more routes than Mims. Franklin's running more routes than Mims. They're both getting more targets than Mims. There's nothing I can point to here. Unless, like, if Mims ends up just being projected for the lowest ownership, then I would play more Mims. But outside of that, I have absolutely no idea how you can make a case for Mims over the other two guys.
Yep.
Targets haven't been there. Like, routes haven't been there compared to the other two. The only case that you can make is Mims was a second-round pick. Sean Payton's been saying for 2 years that he likes him and then doing nothing to actually suggest he likes him. I want Marvin Mims to be a thing, so I think Marvin Mims is a thing. That's the only case for Mims, other than if he just ends up being projected for low ownership.
Yeah. I'm not sure I'm understanding what got to get this win. Since he did say he said Sutton's name or position wrong in plays multiple times. Are you referring to Sean Payton?
I think he's talking about Payton maybe calling wrong plays. I don't know.
Okay. So, and you said, so there's that. The Reynolds stuff is worrisome just because you'd think he'd be able to go. So maybe it's beyond injury related. Yeah, it's possible. Like, but if he's active, I wouldn't be that worried about it.
Right. Like, I'm not going to be worried about it. The way that you would make that argument that I think does make sense is they're getting close to the end of his activation window. So are they activating him just because they need to? But like, still, they could just activate him for next week. I think it's much more likely that he's just been working his way back. Obviously, he went through some stuff other than the broken finger, and that if they activate him this week, he's probably just physically ready to go and he's going to go. But there is that case where it's like, did they activate him kind of out of obligation as opposed to because they really wanted to? But again, like, I don't think they have to this week. They could next week. And so they probably were doing it because he's ready if they do.
Right. Yeah. Assuming that that's true, I guess I have not looked into like when the end of the activation period is. So you think they would have the opportunity to do so next week? If
I'm assuming, and this is just based on the write-up on DraftKings. Like, I haven't looked into it either, but it just it says he's nearing the end of his 21-day activation window. So it's possible the team will activate him ahead of Monday's contest. That doesn't read to me like he needs to be activated.
Right. It seems like they would say that if that were the case,
right,
most likely. But yeah, maybe I'll look into it, make sure. And then the other point that Steven makes is the thing you can't measure with Reynolds is Nick's being comfortable with the guys he's been doing well with lately. Totally unquantifiable. Depends how you feel about that as a narrative. Yeah, that maybe they don't have full, but they played a little bit together early in the year. So I'd assume that they practice together. But yeah, that's I guess worth thinking about.
Yeah. So like, I agree with the logic. There's two kind of issues. One, like you said, they've been practicing together. They did play 5 games together. And also, if Reynolds is on the field and like Mims isn't, there's not a lot Knicks can do about it. Like, it's not like Knicks is going to look off Reynolds because he trusts where Mims is going to be. If Mims is on the sideline, he is either going to throw it to Reynolds or he's not.
Right. Yeah, I guess the thing that I want to make sure of and hopefully find some kind of notes is like, are they activating him because they need to? But then I think they can activate him off IR and still have him inactive for the game. I don't know. We'll know more prior to the game starting. Any other notes on wide receivers?
I'm trying to do like quick math. Hang on.
Okay. You're doing the 21 day. You're doing some addition.
They have until Wednesday to activate him.
Okay. So they could just activate him for next week then. Yeah. So that's probably not a huge risk that they activate him out of necessity. Okay. Good to know. Tight ends, David Njoku, best projection on the slate of tight ends by a good margin. Interestingly, Jordan Akins also projects better than anybody of Denver's tight ends here. I'm curious if that is the case. At RotoGrinders, David Njoku projecting for just under 10 fantasy points. And then the next best projected tight end is, Jordan Akins, 5 fantasy points. Pretty interesting. So the Denver tight ends looking projecting pretty well. 38% going to David Njoku in the flex. Jordan Akins getting 8% in the flex. At captain, Njoku getting 11% ownership here. I guess Akins maybe is playable at captain. No, 0% ownership going to Akins. Where do you see the optimal rates for Njoku first?
So I think Njoku, like obviously he looks good. He projects well. I think he's tied with Bo Nix for me right now for most overowned player on the slate. But still 29% optimal at cap or at flex, 4% at captain. So relatively likely to be in the optimal lineup, but not as likely as guys like Nick, Sutton, Jameis, Jeudy. And so going overowned in both spots. Did run routes on 96.5% of dropbacks last week. Tillman being out certainly isn't going to hurt him. You can get more 2 tight end sets. We saw Akins run routes on about 45% of dropbacks without it cutting into, while Njoku was also having like a season high route participation. So they were just using them together more often after Tillman left. So that definitely makes Njoku look better. It also opens up more targets in general just because Tillman's not out there. So I think that the case for Njoku is pretty clear that he's one of 2 guys that you would expect to lead Cleveland in targets in this game, but he is also up to $8,400. It's not, a cheap price point or anything like that. So good play in terms of chances of being optimal, but I think relative to ownership right now, at least, also going a bit overowned. Denver also has been a bottom 10 fantasy matchup for opposing tight ends so far this year, particularly good when they are split out. I'm pulling it up now to
wait, Adam. I'm realizing we didn't even talk about the Cleveland receivers. So maybe let's group them all together. All of the Cleveland receivers and tight ends together. Because we've gone so long. This is such a complicated slate that we've gone a little bit long. So let's group in the Cleveland receivers with the Cleveland tight ends. It's a mess here. So let's take a look at. I'm going to pull up the past 4 games with Jameis Winston so we can do it quickly. They had their bye in there, so we got to go back to week 8. And I guess we can also just take a look at it in terms of the route participation, because we've had pretty strong usage for, Jerry Jeudy, you can see here, 90+% of the routes, I guess 86+% of routes. Each of the 4 games with Jameis Winston. Elijah Moore has been kind of mid-70s. David Njoku, 70s, up to, as you said, 97% last week. Tillman had been running a lot of routes. Now he's out. We see Jordan Akins get a big bump, and then Jamari Thrash gets a little bit of a bump for Cleveland. So that's kind of the layout of the land for the Browns receivers. And then as far as target share, the one thing really worth noting is that Elijah Moore, even though he's not running that many routes, has been getting basically the same number of targets as the other top receivers for the Browns. Sorry, we need to take a step back there to include those receivers, because it's a lot more straightforward, I would say, with the Browns. Like we kind of know for the most part what to expect. I guess with Tillman being out, it gets a little bit hairier there, but for the most part, we kind of know what to expect there. So starting at the top with Jerry Jeudy getting 3% ownership at captain. At flex, Jerry Jeudy getting 36% ownership. What are you seeing as the optimal rates for Jerry Jeudy? Is he? You said that you really like the Browns' passing game in general. Is he one that you're going to be over the field at 3% captain ownership?
I have been projected for 10% captain, and I think that's too low. He showed up optimal at captain 14% of the time, which is, I do think he's going under-owned there. He's going a little bit over-owned for me at flex. One caveat here, though, is that he clearly projects as the best pass catcher for Cleveland. He has the 4th highest projection on the slate behind the 2 quarterbacks and Courtland Sutton. He probably is going to see a lot of Surtain in this game, which is not what you want. And Tillman being out, obviously increases that likelihood as well. I know that Fantasy Points has him projected for shadow coverage. The one thing that does look good is that he's run 30% of his routes in the slot, and Surtain generally, doesn't go into the slot. But I do think it's a spot where if you look at the way the Browns are likely to, who is likely to be defending who, it sets up as a much better matchup for Elijah Moore running the bulk of his routes from the slot than it does for Jerry Jeudy. I generally don't care too much about wide receiver cornerback matchups, but Surtain is kind of an exception to that.
Yeah.
When you're being, and the reason isn't even the talent level as far as success, on pass attempts. As you can see on the screen that you're showing, 0.14 fantasy points per route. It's if you have a corner that quarterbacks are intentionally not throwing at, there's not a lot that the receiver can do, because that's a game plan standpoint where going in, the team is saying, Jeudy's probably going to be defended by Surtain a lot, which means we need to be running plays where Elijah Moore is the first read or David Njoku is the first read or whatever. And that, kind of just by default makes him get less targets. So that's the concern here, is that from like the broader standpoint of just talent level and all of that, Jerry Jeudy's the number one wide receiver here. It's not particularly close. And that makes him look good and project well. But if you do want to dig into those matchups and how the Browns are likely to attack the Broncos defense, I think you can make the case for just saying that Jerry Jeudy's being over projected by the field. And as a result, Elijah Moore, David Njoku, Akins, the running game potentially is being, Jerome Ford as a pass catcher are being under projected. So I do think that in this particular case, you can make that argument. I have not done anything to lower Jeudy's projection yet, in which case I think he is going under owned. But I do think, again, that you make a pretty strong case for like any pass catcher other than Jeudy, basically.
Yeah. So we'll try to keep it quick with the pass catchers on Cleveland. So I'll just go with the synopsis of 4 games now with Jameis Winston as the starter. Jerry Jeudy leads the team with 35 targets in those 4 games. So really strong target share on 89.4% route participation. Elijah Moore, number 2 in targets, 33 targets in those 4 games on just 75% route participation, where he's lagging behind some of the other receivers. Cedric Tillman is out for this game. He's been targeted 30 times in those 4 games. So he's, big hole opening up with Cedric Tillman being out. David Njoku, 27 targets on 80.4% route participation. Seems like a number that could go up as probably their best pass catcher. Jordan Akins, 12 targets in those 4 games, was kind of seeing some targets anyway. And then we saw the route participation go up significantly with Tillman out last week. And then Jamari Thrash is projected pretty well. He's projected around the industry for around 5 fantasy points, expected to take some of that work that Cedric Tillman left behind. In terms of ownership in the flex, we have Jerry Jeudy coming in at 36% ownership. We have David Njoku coming in 38% ownership. Elijah Moore, 21% ownership. Jordan Akins, 8% ownership. Jamari Thrash, 8% ownership. And then I guess Kadarius Toney could mix in a little bit as well. 1% projected ownership going to Kadarius Toney. At captain, we have sort by ownership here. David Njoku coming in at 11% ownership. Jerry Jeudy coming in at 3% ownership. Elijah Moore, 1% captain ownership. Jordan Akins, 0%. I guess the rest are all 0%. So getting back to the flex ownership, Adam, how are we feeling? So you kind of went over the Jerry Jeudy stuff. 38% Njoku. I know you were getting there before we move back to wide receiver. How do you feel about 38% in the flex for Njoku and 11% at captain?
I think it's a little bit too high. I'm not getting there as far as optimal goes. Like I was saying, if you wanted to bump the projection to Njoku a little bit, if you think that they're just kind of going to use Jeudy as a decoy, then that would make him look a little bit better. But I have him projected right now behind Jeudy, similarly to Chubb, not that far ahead of like Javonte Williams, not far ahead at all of Elijah Moore. So I do think the ownership's coming in a little bit high when most of those other guys aren't getting nearly as much ownership projected right now, especially a captain. But still one of the more likely plays to be in an optimal lineup. And as I mentioned, 96.5% route participation last week. I do expect you'll see more 12 personnel with Tillman out, where Akins and Njoku are both in. I was mentioning it before we went back to wide receiver, but Denver's defense so far this year, bottom 10 matchup for opposing tight ends, especially when they're split out. They've actually been a pretty neutral matchup for inline tight ends, but when they're running routes split out, it's been a bad matchup. I expect that you'll see Akins running more of the inline routes with Njoku split out. I haven't actually double checked that, but pretty sure that'll be the case. So, not, again, just a small noisy data point. I don't like digging into that kind of stuff too much, but
yeah,
it is worth pointing out.
Yep. Moving down, Elijah Moore projected for just 21% ownership. He's 7,800. That feels like a little bit too low to me. What are you seeing with? I guess he's kind of expensive enough that maybe it's not that low, but how much are you getting to of Elijah Moore, or what's the optimal right there?
Yeah, relatively expensive. I think I'm pretty much in line with the field right now. 26% optimal at flex, 5.5%, 6% optimal at captain, which is pretty much where I'm seeing him projected right now. If you wanted to argue that maybe he gets a little bit more work just because of Jeudy's matchup, I think that's reasonable. But again, going back to the whole, like, I don't like looking at wide receiver corner data all that much. If you actually look at schedule adjusted fantasy points this year, Denver's been a bad matchup overall for opposing wide receivers. They've been a worse matchup for slot receivers than for outside receivers. So it's been a really tough matchup for slot receivers there, even though if you look at the cornerback data, you would suggest that's where you want to target guys. So I don't think it's like an elite matchup for Elijah Moore or anything like that. I would be cautious, just like ignoring Jeudy and playing more and more, but you could probably make the case that maybe they look to him a little bit more.
Yeah, and maybe he gets some more of that route participation with Cedric Tillman out. So I think he looks pretty good. He also, your numbers are higher on the projected ownership on Elijah Moore, more in line with where I would think they probably should be. He's only projected for 21% flex, 1% at Roto-Grinders, so those numbers feel a bit low. Jordan Akins and Jamari Thrash both projected for about 8% flex ownership. Just given the projections there, those seem like really too low numbers for both Akins and Thrash. So I would think the optimal rate would be higher. But what are you seeing for the optimal rate?
Yeah, I have them both going under owned right now, particularly at flex. Obviously from an upside standpoint, neither one looks great at captain. And this isn't exactly a slate where there's a lot of appeal to just playing a cheap guy at captain so you can fit in all the studs that don't exist because neither of these teams have them.
Yeah.
But Jamari Thrash at only 1K, I assume he's going to be running more routes with Cedric Tillman out. 20% route participation last week. That's a game where Tillman left early, but still ran somewhere around 50% of routes. So I assume you're going to see Thrash out there enough to justify a 1K price tag, have him showing up as optimal about 13% of the time. Akins, only 2,400, 45-ish% route participation last week. And that was, with Njoku running routes pretty much every play. I did also pull up, I don't have it filtered down to just 12 personnel, but overall this season, Akins has run 38.5% of his routes in the slot compared to 31% for Njoku. So not like I said before, I was expecting a bigger split where Njoku is not running inline routes and Akins is. It's kind of been the opposite, if anything. 54% of Njoku's total routes inline, 47% for Akins. I assume it'll be kind of just split here. So again, not reading too much into what I was talking about before, how Denver's allowed fantasy production to tight ends based on where they're running routes from. I think the biggest takeaway here is that Akins is only $2,400 and should see enough routes that if the way I think about this is if Akins were running the same number of routes every single game this year as he's likely to run tonight, he would not be $2,400.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is, you're on 45% of the routes last week. That was with Tillman running 48%. Right. So like Tillman now remove that 48 from Tillman, give some of it to Jordan Akins. Maybe you get 60% route participation, and he's just too cheap for that role. So same page there. Thrash again, only up to 21% last week, but presumably gonna, at least I would guess double that this week is kind of the assumption there. I guess there's some possibility it could be Kadarius Toney instead, but hopefully somebody's inactive and we don't have to worry about it. Yeah. We'll find out more when inactives come out.
And I just filtered it down for the season just because I was curious. But when the Browns have used 12 personnel, 57.4% of Njoku's routes have been in line, 54% of Akins have been in line. So there's no just clear one of them that splits out and one that stays in.
Okay. Yeah, it's good to look at. Anything else on Browns pass catchers?
No.
All right. Let's move on to so now we will move to the tight ends by themselves for the Broncos. We have, it's gross, Adam Troutman projected for just under 3 fantasy points. Lucas Kroll projected for under 2 fantasy points. Nate Adkins under 1 fantasy point. Probably not going to get a ton of ownership going to the Broncos tight ends. And we look in the flex here. Never really seen a tight end room project so poorly before. Adam Troutman projected for 3% ownership with a projection of 3. Lucas Kroll, 2% ownership with a projection of 3. Nate Adkins, 0% ownership projection of 1. What do you have as the optimal rates there?
Yeah, not a lot. I have Kroll optimal 3% of the time, Troutman optimal 6% of the time. pretty close to ownership. We had seen earlier in the year Kroll kind of get an opportunity to be the number one tight end when he jumped Greg Dulcich and he was running a bunch of routes for a couple of weeks. And then pretty quickly the Broncos said, okay, like screw this. And now you're just getting like 25% route participation from Troutman, 20% or 25% from Kroll, less from Atkins. You just have a really ugly 3 wide receiver rotation here, or 3 tight end rotation here, where none of them have emerged as being competent pass catchers. And so you kind of just have 3 guys that from a DFS standpoint, you're just hoping randomly catch a touchdown or something.
Yeah. I mean, just look at the target share. They're all grouped together here. Nobody more than 6.7% in week 10 for Lucas Kroll is the most we've seen over the past 4 weeks from any of them in terms of target share. Just gross. They're not getting much projection. They're sort of all in the like backup tight end mold of like, yep, hope for a touchdown. Otherwise, you probably don't want them. They all kind of fit that bill. So it looks pretty gross there. Defenses, kickers, Adam, we have Will Lutz projected for 14% ownership. Dustin Hopkins projected for 13% ownership. Broncos 22%. Where are the Browns? This can't be right. 5% projected ownership going to the Browns defense. What do you have the number at for the Browns defense?
10.
Huh. That seems extremely low to me. But
also,
I mean, both
10%
those numbers.
chance of being optimal.
Really? I think I would, if they come in 10%, I'm definitely going to have more than that number. What would you see any big discrepancies in terms of optimal rate versus ownership for any of the others?
Broncos captain looks really under-owned.
Broncos captain. What do you have the projection at?
3% projected ownership, 8% chance of being optimal.
Rotographers says at 1% projected ownership. So yeah, if it's 8% optimal, that would be a slam dunk play. If that's the case.
Yeah, like the Browns have allowed the 4th highest pressure rate over expectation so far this season. Broncos defense has the 4th highest pressure rate over expectation. You have a quarterback in Jameis that we know will force the ball into some tight spots. I get it. You know, like obviously playing a defensive captain is never going to feel great, but I have them as like one of the most under-owned captains, basically right alongside Jameis Winston, which obviously doesn't make a ton of sense when you say those 2 things next to each other. But
yeah,
like I get it. There's not a ton of really good skill players on this slate. Jameis doesn't really give you rushing upside at quarterback. Nix may or may not, but he's also, you know, very expensive. Like you have a turnover prone quarterback. You have a defense that's likely to get pressure on the turnover prone quarterback.
Yeah,
you're going to do it. This looks like
makes a lot of sense. Yeah, tough to argue with that. Kickers, do you have any stance on the kickers?
It all just looks fine. 20% optimal for Lutz, 20 or 16% for Hopkins. For both kickers and for the Browns defense, the way I have ownership projected is pretty much the same as flex. The only thing that stands out is the field not getting to enough Broncos defense, particularly a captain.
Okay. So maybe that answers. Coco asks, who's the best captain tonight? It might be the Broncos defense.
Yeah, I mean, it depends how you're asking that. I think the most under-owned captains are Broncos defense and Jameis, followed by Jeudy and Chubb. The best captain in terms of who is going to be captain most often is Bo Nix.
Yeah, like if you're playing cash games, you would throw Bo Nix in the captain immediately.
I assume so. I wouldn't necessarily say that, but probably
because of the price, maybe not.
Right. Like it still depends what you can do with the rest of your lineup. Like Bo Nix is also the most optimal flex play. So, you know, it depends on the rest of your lineup. But if you tell me that you'll give me $100 if I pick the optimal captain and I get $100 no matter who it is, my answer is Bo Nix.
Yeah, he's the most likely to be optimal. Okay, I think that is it. I think we've been through every part of this game. Do you have any other thoughts on the game? Players? Anybody?
No.
Okay, just want to make sure we're not missing anything. I think we've been pretty thorough. Adam, you're doing NBA show tonight on the Endgame channel?
Yeah, 4:30, 4:45, somewhere in there. Slate doesn't start till 7:30, but 4-game NBA slate. Going to be going through how I would approach large field DraftKings tournaments. 4-gamer should be a mess. Celtics have already ruled out half their team, and the other half is questionable. So, assuming they show up for their game with some group of players, should be a pretty interesting slate to walk through.
All right. Yeah. If you're not already subscribed to Adam's channel and you are in the Flannelverse, you can find the link in the description of this video. Go ahead.
I just wanted to hit on the question on my channel. Carrington said, love the channel. How to use the optimal rate if I'm building 150. Is it as simple as meeting the field with the optimal rates, or should I aim to do more with a higher optimal rate overall? So like, I don't explicitly use them at all. Like I'm not going through my lineups and using them, but I do like having them, one, just to be able to talk about on the show, but I think they add some context. And in general, from like a lineup level, if you're playing lineups that you project to be optimal more often than the field is playing them, you're kind of off to a good start in Showdown, I think, or in any format. So like for me personally, like if I weren't doing content, I wouldn't have these in front of me or even, look at them, because I think that the rest of my process is handling everything. But I do think that they can be useful depending on like what your process is. Like before Sims and all of that, when I was just using optimizers, I used them a little bit more just as ways to like evaluate the lineups that I could play, as far as who's going over owned, who's going under owned, because I do think that they're useful as far as, you'll get people saying like, oh, this player is 25% owned, that's too high. You can't say that unless you have a way of measuring what the actual correct ownership is. And optimal rates can help with that. And in Showdown, like generally you need the optimal lineup to win, so they can be more useful there. Like in classic slates and stuff, you're basically never making the optimal lineup. You're not trying to make the optimal lineup. So if somebody is optimal 20% and their own 30%, it doesn't actually mean a ton. But in Showdown, you are actually trying to build the optimal lineup. And so I think depending on your process, it's more or less useful like having the data. But yeah, so there's different ways to approach it, but I do think it just kind of adds context in general.
Yeah, no, that's a good answer. Good to hit on that question. Yes, Adam is also flanneled up for this show. Doesn't wear it nearly as often as I do.
I don't know. I don't know if this is flannel. It's like a pattern, but it's not the material. I don't think
the material is not flannel. Okay,
no, it's just kind of like
buffalo
it's like
plaid, maybe,
but it's not. It's like lighter than flannel.
Okay, all right. So no, he's not flanneled up. Although buffalo plaid, whatever the pattern, I just call it flannel regardless.
Yeah.
All right. Check out Adam's channel. If you're not already subscribed, you can find the link in the description of this video. If you're in the Flannelverse, Adam will be back doing some NBA content tonight, so make sure you check that out if you're playing NBA. Anything else that you want to shout out, Adam? Anything that you have? Anything else going on?
Nope.
At ShipMyMoney DFS on the socials. I will be doing a solo show after we get inactive. It's about 85 minutes prior to lock, again on the Flannelverse channel. So come check that out when we have a bit more information. I do want to shout out, this is the final day of the Thanksgiving sale at 4 for 4. You can get the rest of the season DFS package for just $7. So fantastic deal at 4 for 4. If you want to get my main slate breakdowns for tournaments and cash games, those all go behind the paywall at 4 for 4. So if you want that $7 just for the rest of today, use promo code Flannelverse at Fantasy Points to get 50% off anything. They also have a great deal going on. And of course, Rotogrinders, what you're looking at right now, this is Rotogrinders lineup HQ. That is the optimizer that Rotogrinders uses. I'm sure they have some kind of a deal going on right now. I don't know the specifics of it. All right, that's going to do it for this show. Thanks, Adam. Thank you all. Make sure you're subscribed. Make sure you do subscribe if you're not already. I'll be back tonight. See you then.